The visual art style that becomes popular in the late 18th century is Neoclassicism. This is a continuation of the art of the Enlightenment that we see at the end of the last class, and features a similar seriousness and focus on narrative. However, after 1760, there becomes a new interest in all things Greek and Roman, in part due to that discovery of the city of Pompeii that I mentioned in the last video. Just like we see in the 1920s with the discovery of King Tut's tomb, these major archaeological finds can set off worldwide trends that spark interest in those cultures. So in the later 18th century, artists start to combine that seriousness and emphasis on narrative that we see in the art of the Enlightenment, and bring that style to paintings that show us stories from Greek and Roman history and mythology. This is similar to the kind of history painting that we talked about yesterday when we mentioned Watteau applying to the French Academy of Painting and Sculpture. He was trying to be a history painter. So this is essentially what he was trying to do. This movement was widespread and varied. We see artists from throughout Europe who embrace this style. Angelika Kauffmann actually travels widely throughout Europe. She's one of two female founding members of the English Academy of Fine Arts, which is a counterpart to the French Academy we've talked about, founded in the 18th century. But she lives a significant part of her adult life in Italy, and specifically in Rome, where she gets inspiration for these types of paintings. She also has a fairly unconventional life in that she trains in her teenage years as an opera singer, allowing her an ability to travel and have experiences that most teenage girls weren't having in the 18th century. This particular painting shows us Cornelia presenting her children as her treasures, and the alternative title is The Mother of the Gracchi. So paintings like this often have a strong moral message, and just in case you miss it in the painting, it's reiterated not once but twice in the title. So what is happening here is we see the figure in white is Cornelia, and she's a famous Roman matron or married woman, and she was married to a famous Roman general. The woman on the right-hand side in red is a visitor to her household, and we can see this woman in red has many treasures, many jewels. And she asks Cornelia, where are your treasures, or where are your jewels? And Cornelia, in her simple, again, white clothing, says, I don't need treasures, I don't need jewels, I have my children are my treasures. So again, this is a very unsubtle moral message. We can also see that Kauffmann uses the colors, so Cornelia is dressed in white and purple, the colors of royalty, and the visitor is dressed in red, this color that's associated with sin, even today, kind of harlotry or scandal in some way. Similarly, the second part of the title, The Mother of the Gracchi, reference the two children that we see on the far left of the painting. These two sons of Cornelia will grow up to be famous Roman politicians. In the 18th century, they were seen as some of the first Roman politicians to really take into account the will of the people. So they are seen as kind of foundational or aspirational figures having to do with democracy. Today, if we read about the Gracchi, our assessment is slightly more nuanced and complex. We think of them as often using mob rule to get their way today. But at the time, these would have been seen as ideals of these kinds of new democratic values that were coming into prominence. Notice this painting is painted in 1785, so just about 10 years after the founding of the United States. We see similar images in France. So Jacques-Louis David had a remarkable career that spanned really the whole second half of the 18th and into the early 19th century. And he was fortunate enough to be in Rome when Pompeii was discovered, and he comes back to France after his time in Rome as one of the premier painters and one of the most famous painters of his day. He also takes a position as the court painter to Louis XVI, where he paints this painting. And here again, like with Kauffmann, we see a story that's referencing in this case, a Greek a Roman tragedy. So the Oath of the Horatii tells a story from the early days of Rome, when Roman territory was first starting to expand, and Rome was in a war with its neighbor city of Alba, and these two cities each have a set of triplet brothers. They decide that rather than having a large battle where many people will die, they will have a smaller battle where these two sets of three brothers will each fight each other, and the winner will determine the outcome of the battle. The moment that David shows us here shows us these three brothers vowing to fight and give their lives, if necessary, in service to their country. In the center is their father Horatius, who reckons the cost of this action. We can see the troubled expression on his face, but is ultimately doing his duty and asking for the blessing of the gods. And then on the far right, we see their sisters. One of these sisters, the one in black closest to Horatius, is married to one of these other sets of brothers, who we call the Curatii, and we can see her dressed in mourning that either her brother or her husband are going to die. And like with Kaufmann, the moral message here is fairly clear and unsubtle. There's an obvious patriotic message that you should be willing to sacrifice and, if necessary, die for the good of your state. We also might see that, similar to Kaufmann's work, neoclassical art in general uses the obvious signs and symbols of the classical world. So in architecture, we look for things like pillars and arches. The clothing is not always historically accurate, but it should look recognizably ancient. If we got costume historians or dress historians in here, they might have any number of problems with how these figures are dressed, but most people in the 18th century, and most people today, would look at this and say, yeah, they probably look like ancient Romans to us. So we are looking for those visual signifiers that imply the ancient world. We see similar things in sculpture, where there's a focus on those stories from classical mythology. In this case, Psyche and Cupid are figures from mythology rather than history. And while this statue is three-dimensional, you have to really walk around it and see it from all sides to appreciate it, it's not complex or intertwined in the way we see with the Baroque. There is a simple message and one simple action taking place. So there's a somewhat streamlined version of the more dramatic art that we see in the early 18th and the 17th century as we move into the later half of the 18th century.